I have my 2.5-inch strips cut, ready for my binding. And to join the strips, we're going to put them right sides together. And we're going to, I've already started to sew this at a diagonal, so that when these are joined, you end up with one long continuous strip. I have some odd pieces here because this is the salvage edges that I have not trimmed off yet. So I lined them up to accommodate that. I can cut those off, and at the same time I'm going to cut this down to a 1/4-inch seam. I'm going to cut this to a 1/4-inch seam and cut off that dog ear. And now I'm ready to take this to the ironing board, and I'm going to press the entire strip wrong sides together. One last step before I take this strip to the ironing board is that I'm going to cut the right hand end of the strip at a 45-degree angle, and that means with the fabric facing up, it's the end on the right hand side rather than the left. So I've lined up the fabric along this line, and on the mat you can see that there's a 45-degree angle, and that's what we want to cut. So I'm going to put my ruler along that line and cut that. And this is in preparation for joining the pieces once the binding is sewn onto the quilt. And now I'm going to go to the iron to press the whole strip lengthwise, wrong sides. The reason why we put our seams at an angle and iron them flat is that now that we fold this in half, you can see the effect of having distributed that seam so that it's not all in one seam, because otherwise if you had a seam straight across and folded it, now you're going to have a double heavy weight of the seam, and when you fold it again with the binding, now you've made it thick 4 times. So this is the best way to distribute that seam, by putting it at a diagonal, pressing it flat in one direction, and then you can see how it gets distributed, so you're not doubling up on that one spot. Because I have a piping already put onto my quilt, I'm using a zipper foot to put on the binding. That's not normal, however, because of that ridge of the cord, I can't use the regular foot. Normally when we start with the binding, we're going to leave a tail of about 5 or 6 inches, and then we can start sewing the quilt. And I'm lining the quilt up exactly with the edge of the quilt. And if sometimes it makes things easier just to use a bit of a glue just to get things going, so it's easier to control it just to get started. And once I get started, I'm going to do a couple of back stitches, and I am sewing at a 1/4 inch. And I have told my machine that I'm using woven heavy fabric, and I have set my stitch length at 2.5. And with the zipper foot, you can see that there is a ridge there, and I'm sewing right next to it. So I've done a bit of a back stitch, and I'm going to sew to the end of this row a 1/4 inch before the edge of the fabric. And as it happens, this foot gives me a good accurate 1/4 inch. And there's the edge of my fabric. And I don't like to guess, so I am going to measure and I will put a dot where I want to stop. Is that a 1/4 inch? There. Back stitch a bit. And cut the thread. To get ready, I like to fold this over and make a bit of a crease, because that helps me to find where that's going to line up with the top of the next side. So I'm going to take this, and this is going to go, this is lining up here because we want to make a squared mitered corner. And I'm going to find where I last stopped stitching, which is right there. That fold should be at the top edge of that first edge that you made, and this side should line up with the edge, the next edge of the quilt. And I believe my dot was right there. So that's where I'm going to put my needle in to start sewing. And I'm just going to continue with this whole side until I get to the next corner, and the next 3 corners will be done in the same manner. And when I get to the last side, I'm going to stop sewing about 8 inches away from the point that I started. Okay, I finished sewing the binding around, and I've left about a 10-inch gap between where I've stopped sewing, and I did a backstitch there, and where I started sewing, of course, I did a backstitch there. I'm going to lay the end piece down, and I've got a little bit too much there to lay flat, so I'm just going to cut this small piece off. And this piece I'm going to take and lay over top of it, and where it meets the top piece, I'm going to put a line just under the edge of the starting piece. And now we're going to take this piece, and where I made that mark, I'm going to line that up along the 45 degrees. Sometimes this can get to be a little bit tricky because we're working with some tight corners. I'm lining this fabric up along that line, and I have my 45-degree line here, and we're going to cut 45 degrees, except we're going to add a 1/4 inch for the seam. And if you want to make a line first and then cut, or you can just simply go ahead and cut. And you can see that that 45-degree cut is going to match this. And now I'm going to cut this piece, and then we'll be able to put this together. And because we have this trim, we know exactly where the pieces are going to match up. And you can see that they're heading in the right direction, and now they have to go together, right sides together. So I pulled that up. They're going to be right sides together this way. This looks kind of tricky, but this method is a lot simpler than a lot of people use complicated rulers, and you have to measure exactly 6 inches and then 2 inches over from the center and blah blah blah. But this I find is much easier. I always had trouble trying to figure out which way I was supposed to turn these two ends to make them match and go the right way, and I could never get it done. Once we've sewn that seam, you can already see that it's going to snap to and lay flat. So I'm going to take that to the sewing machine and stitch that seam. I've sewn my seam. This is on a bias, so be careful not to stretch it as you're sewing. Just let the machine do the work, and with the feed dogs to pull the fabric forward. You can use the center fold from both pieces to get to line up in the center, and at the end you'll have a 1/4 inch dog ear. And I changed my stitch length back down to 2. And we can't take this to the iron, so I'm just going to finger press it a little bit. And when it lays flat, you can see that it fills in that whole gap, and you are ready to go ahead and finish sewing this seam to get ready for turning the binding to the back. Now that my binding is joined and the binding sort of snaps into place, I can go back to the machine and finish sewing that part that was left open. So I'm going to do a bit of a back stitch, and I do like to keep my needle in down position and make sure that line everything up, and simply continue sewing along. And remember, I've got that piping in here, so I'm going to make sure that my stitching is right against that piping cord. And I can actually feel it with my fingernail to make sure that I'm still getting right against that. Now, before I go any further, I'm going to check all of my seams to make sure that I'm satisfied with how close I got my seam, my binding sewn against the cord. And if there are any little gaps, then I can just go back and re-sew that area, right, and making sure now that I get against the cord, because you don't want to have to worry about something like that later, because what you want to see is this, rather than something that you've got where you've got a gap. And even here, I mentioned before about the color thread that I used on my piping. This is where, if there is a gap between the binding and the piping, you will see that stitching. So this is why now you can see how important it was to use the same color thread on the piping. But just check all of your seams before you go any further, just to make sure that you're satisfied with that. And now we're at the point of getting ready to sew the binding on the back. Before we get going on sewing this on the back, we're going to be hand stitching it, I'm going to check my corners to make sure that I have a proper join, because you remember when you started sewing here, you wanted to start exactly where you left off there. So to check it, I'm just going to fold this over and make sure that I'm going to get a nice mitered corner. And if I'm not going to get a nice 45-degree angle, this is when I'm going to go back and undo a bit of stitching and then redo it. Now we're going to switch over to the back, and from the back we're going to again do a mitered corner. So I'm going to just fold this over a little bit just to put that into place, and I'm going to fold this over to hold that in place as well. I can hide that thread in there, and it doesn't want to hide, so I will clip it instead. Okay, so I'm going to fold this over and clip it. Now I prefer to use clips instead of pins, because when you pin this you end up with a really big ridge, and to me that doesn't work, and it's also distorting the edge. So by using a clip instead, I'm going to avoid that. Now our miter on the front is leaning towards the right, and apparently you don't want to have it leaning in the same direction from the back. And what I have, by folding it this way, I have created what apparently is a pig's nose or a pig's ear, and this is not acceptable in judging. So instead of folding it that direction, I'm going to fold it this way. And to make things easy, we're going to use the magic pen, the glue pen, and put a bit of glue down there. And to do the miter, you're actually getting this fold right in there. Pull this over, and it should come to very easily to a nice tidy miter. And I'm just going to double check that I have these going in the opposite directions. Yes, I do. And again, put some glue down there to hold that in place. And I can use a clip to, if it's just not, if it's lining up like that, you just have to move it very slightly and you'll get those corners to meet quite nicely. And put a clip on there just to hold that in place. And I'm ready to start sewing. I'm right-handed, so I'm going to be sewing going from right to left. I have a single strand of thread with a knot in it, and I'm using thread that matches my binding. If I were to, because sometimes some of your stitches are going to show up, so if you are trying to match your backing instead, it will show up on your binding. So I'm going to bury my knot, so I'm just going to lift this up, and I'm going to start over here leading up to the corner. So I'm just going to stitch under here, just go through one layer. Of course I have to lose my, it became unthreaded. And where I came out there, I'm going to just pick up very slightly the very edge of the binding. Most of your stitching is in the backing, so I'm going to go down into the backing and up to just catch the very edge of the binding with very small stitches. Your stitch length should be, I guess, about 1/4 inch. Again, I'm going in just under the edge of the binding, just through the top layer of the backing, and then up to through the binding. And when I come to the corner, I'm going to actually stitch down that whole corner. So I'm going to go up through all of those layers. And the same way, I'm going to go down a very small stitch over the edge of the binding into the bottom layer and pick up just a small corner. And again, I just want to secure this so I never have to worry about it coming unfolded. And I can do the same to come down, or I can simply bury the stitch to come out to the bottom if you don't want to restitch the whole thing. And so I'm going to start in here. Again, just through the backing, up into the binding, just to catch the edge. To do a knot, I'm just going to again just pick up this and here. A quilter's knot. uses a needle. I think the eye of my needle is a little bit too big, so I should probably be using a smaller needle. Quilter's knot. Wrap the thread twice and it pulls all the way down. And then I'm going to bury the thread. Just come into the binding through a distance, and I'm going to give it a little bit of a tug and clip the thread so it gets buried. And you're going to do that around your entire quilt.